we going to sit or we just sit? That's good. I mean, we don't stand, we just sit. That's good.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's because they're live streaming us too, so.
It's better to sit. Okay, that's good.
She told me. I will ask Laura to make sure, but I think it will be fine that way. That's why they have the mic here.
Okay.
And what I'll do is I'm going to do just a brief summary, and then I'm going to introduce each of you with your full bio right before you speak.
Okay.
And I'll let you speak one at a time and then go to the next one.
Okay.
Do their bio and the next one. Don't forget to touch on
Takyiwaa, thank you very much.
Let me give you my card.
Pleasure to share that.
Okay.
Delia. Our former managing director comes as well. Yeah. He has left us in December. We have a new managing director, which is a woman.
Okay.
Yeah, Patricia Moreira. But the organization working in the same line.
If everyone could please take their seats, we're going to begin with the next session. Okay, Angie, it's all yours. You want me to do one more time? I'll do it. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the first session and the coffee break. If you could all please find your seats, we're going to begin with the next session. So, Angie, you'll introduce yourself. And then
From here, they're going to all go up to the podium, and I'm going to stay here.
Hello, everyone. Whoops. Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? No. Laura, it's not on. Hello? Okay, now we're good. Hello, everybody. If you could take your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. It's my great pleasure to be here with you to introduce this next panel. I'm going to kick off with a little bit of an introduction to myself and why I'm here. I'm Angie Rozas. I actually work for the Coca-Cola Company, and I am part of a group. I am Senior Director for Social Impact. I'm part of an organization that has been leading women's economic empowerment for the company, mostly through a goal that we established back in 2010 called 5 by 20. I'm really happy to be here. I'll tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing and why it's important for this conversation around access to information, but I'm really here to hear what everybody else has to say in this area and to learn from this distinguished panel as well as the rest of you who I'm sure will have plenty of comments and questions for us as well. So Coca-Cola, from our perspective, we believe there's no bigger investment than in women to really unlock and spur economic growth in the world. We know that women are pillars in the community and society. They are responsible for local and global growth. From a purchasing standpoint, they represent most of the purchasing decisions in the household. And we also operate in over 200 countries around the world. So we believe that when we invest in women, we're actually investing in our future. Several people have also noted here that women tend to overinvest or are likely to invest more in food, education, and healthcare for their families and their children. This has a ripple effect to the community. So when communities thrive, companies like Coca-Cola, who are global companies, thrive as well. And that's why we believe that investing in women is so important. It's a shared value initiative where we are also investing in the future. So our program is a goal to enable 5 million women entrepreneurs around and across our global value chain by 2020. Currently, I'm working on the 2017 total numbers, but we have, as of mid-year this year, enabled 1.9 million women entrepreneurs across our global value chain. Thank you very much. What we do is we have local programs. The programs are designed at the local level by our teams, looking at the context of women, where they are, and the barriers that they're facing. But universally, we know that women across our value chain really faced 3 main barriers to economic success. And one of those is access to business skills training. Second is access to financial services and or assets, and the third being access to peer networks and mentoring relationships. So each of the programs, although they are developed locally, they have that in mind where they apply one or more of those enabling activities to the program. So that brings me back now to why information, how does this fit with the topic? And actually I can give a couple of examples. If you think about even the business skills training, we took business skills training and a 13-module curriculum that we started back in 2010 And we applied it fairly recently to mobile learning, as well as an application in a couple of different markets. Indonesia and Malaysia are two examples where we piloted it. The reason why we did it was we initially started in classroom training and got feedback that for cultural, personal, family, and even business reasons, the woman could not leave her home or her business to go and attend training to gain this valuable information on how to better her business skills. So we brought those applications to her in the mobile form in a time and a place where she could access that information on her own and not lose out to those skills. We also know and do a lot of information relative to farming. We provide farming practices for men and women in sustainable agricultural practices, in better farming, in drip irrigation and other farming principles. But we also know that if women don't participate in the actual forms of selling or marketing what they farm, then they lose out on reaping the benefits of the crops and on the sale and the revenue to the household of what the farm produces. So we know that access to information is highly important in all aspects of our value chain, and that's why I find this information today so important, and I'm really excited to learn more about it from our esteemed panel. So with that, I'm going to get started, and I'm going to introduce each one of our speakers, and they're going to come up to the podium and speak about their topic. But before I do that, I'm going to give a brief bio to each of you on these fabulous women. So I'm going to start with Takyiwaa Manuh, who is a professor, recently retired as the Director of Social Development Policy Division at the UN Economic Commission for Africa, based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Before, she had been a professor of African Studies at the University of Ghana, where she also served as Director of the Institute of African Studies between 2002 and 2009. She was born in Kumasi. She was educated at the Wesley Girls High School in the Cape Coast, the University of Ghana, the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Indiana University in the U.S. Her research studies include African development, women's rights and empowerment, contemporary African migrations, and African higher education systems. She has also published widely in these areas. She was instrumental in setting up the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy and the Center for Migration Studies at the University of Ghana. So please help me welcome Takyiwaa to the podium, and she's going to focus her information to us on expanding on the women's economic empowerment.
Thank you very much, Angela. Good afternoon, or is it still morning? I want to begin by thanking the Carter Center for inviting me to be part of this wonderful event. This morning was fantastic. I learned a lot, and I look forward to learning and interacting with all of you over the next 2 days. So I've been asked to focus on women's economic empowerment and what access to information can do. So I just, as a professor, we like to start from first principles. So when we're talking about economic empowerment, we're talking about two concepts, the concepts of empowerment and economic advancement. And specifically, in relation to women, we are focusing on approaches that concentrate on the factors that help women to succeed and advance in the marketplace, including increasing their skills, access to productive resources, and improving the enabling and institutional arrangements and resources for women in the ability to make and act on their decisions in order to benefit from economic growth and development. Now, even though I'm focusing on economic empowerment, we know, and I think that the morning session brought out quite clearly, how economic empowerment has very close links with social and political empowerment and social and cultural factors that limit women's ability to interact and benefit from markets. For example, if we think about the unpaid and unequitably distributed domestic and care work that women in most regions of the world engage in, the limited mobility, prevalence of sexual and gender-based violence, it is clear that in order for women's economic empowerment to proceed, we do need initiatives that also address these other constraints. So a specific question to me was, in terms of women's empowerment, what is the situation facing women today? Now, this is a very big question, Laura, and there are clearly global variations. And UN Women has done facts and figures on economic empowerment, which is very useful. And it looks at the world of work, it looks at wage gaps, it looks at women in agriculture, etc. And it brings out the difference, you know. But one of the glaring issues is that if we look at women's labor force participation rates, we know that as measured, okay, not the fact, but how it is measured, we know that compared to men, women's labor force participation rates globally are estimated at about 47% compared to the 72% for men. But we also know that this does not include all the unpaid and care work that women engage in. And McKinsey, for instance, has estimated that if full labor force gender parity were to be reached, global GDP would be about $28 trillion higher in the next 10 years than it is currently. We also know that pay rates globally between men and women are not equal, and that on average, women globally earn 60 to 75% of male ages. There are also gender inequalities in time use, in the unpaid work burden, and that more women are found in more informal and vulnerable employment. There are also gender differences in law. In fact, the UN Women's Fact Sheet finds that several jurisdictions actually restrict women's economic opportunities in law. Sometimes it is about, you know, getting the consent of husband or the sectors of the economy that are closed to women. If we look at women in agricultural production, we know that women everywhere make important contributions, but the conditions under which they work, whether it is in terms of access to land, to inputs, to extension services, credit, etc., all of these affect the relative ability of female and male farmers and investors, entrepreneurs, to invest, to operate to scale, and to benefit from new economic opportunities. And one of the interesting findings is that most investors and financial institutions do not intentionally discriminate based on gender, but it is that very neutrality that leads to the unequal outcomes. We also know that many more women have enterprises because they don't need access to land to set up a small microcredit business or a microenterprise. But these women-led enterprises tend to be smaller, they tend to have lower profits, and operate in sectors with lower barriers to entry. And globally, female ownership is more prevalent for smaller enterprises, with women earning approximately owning about 30 to 39% of the very small segment of firms. When it comes to small SMEs and to medium-sized companies, then you see it's almost like a pyramid, you know, so the very, very basic enterprises, there are lots of women, but as you go up, it narrows. But if we think, you know, so the UN fact sheet is there, we can look at it and see all those things. But the overarching issues around women's economic empowerment focus around perception, interpretation, and analysis. For instance, when we talk about women's economic empowerment, the terminology ignores the power dynamics at the heart of discrimination and inequality. And we find that many of the examples that we give is about empowering individual women to take part in certain types of economic activity, but it does not begin to break down the patriarchal power relations and systems that deny or limit women's access, participation, and recognition in a range of economic spheres. And a lot of the rhetoric and action related to women's empowerment focuses on access for women to existing economic systems that are riddled with discrimination, and I'm sure many examples could be given. At the same time, in terms of what is changing, I think that we can say that there is greater recognition and documentation of the power to leverage change to strengthen economic outcomes and transform those outcomes into health, social, and other communal benefits through investing in economic transformation for women. And many examples could be given of how making a little more money has enabled women to go to access healthcare facilities, to send their children to school, etc. We have so many of these examples, but the system is still very intact. It is not moving. And we know that, as Aminata said this morning, the rhetoric is greater than the action, as she was asking me of my president, that, there's a lot of talk. What is changing? What is moving? No. I explained. It is good to talk, but after the talk, you must move. Okay. But we know that often the action is limited to superficial adjustments rather than the economic transformations that are needed. But of course, the greater recognition also gives opportunities for transformation, and I want to emphasize the fact that whether it is with enterprises or with information, it's not just about many more things, but what really changes, and it's about transformation, especially where there are partnerships that work beyond traditional and often marginalizing ways of working on women's empowerment. So I wanted to give the example of Unilever. I'm sorry it cannot be Coca-Cola.
Oh, no.
But
I love everybody who does work in this space.
okay, so Unilever, for instance, and I'm giving a private sector example because often we do not see too many of these examples from the private sector. Unilever has shown great leadership in improving representation of women at board and senior executive level, and followed that with analysis and action in relation to internal policy development, labor rights, analysis and action, training transformation, etc., and communications with a gender lens throughout the internal and external relations and their relations with agricultural workers. So it is important that we take a holistic approach to policy structures and relationships in economic transformation of women that looks at the context of rights as well as services and specific training and access issues. And we could talk about USAID, we could talk about the UN's women empowerment principles, gender equality principles, etc. So how does the lack of information exacerbate the problem of women's economic empowerment? We can think about this in multiple ways. One way is that it stops strategic investments in economic transformation for women. For example, if women are perceived to work mainly in the informal sector, and statistics and analysis of informal work is not collected, collated, and analyzed, then investment in transformation can target marginal or irrelevant areas. And we know that several pilot schemes have been run by civil society and sometimes public sector organizations to look at the impact on the improvement of economic security through access to current market prices for agricultural products being grown and sold by women. The additional information that women gain can increase their confidence to negotiate adequate compensation for their products. But of course, it doesn't deal with issues of infrastructure fragility, discriminatory practices that promote or facilitate male middlemen in commodity sales, or even the exorbitant interest rates that microcredit loans to women. This is what women may have greater access to rather than bank loans, but then the interest rate tend to be very exorbitant. So it is good to know the right price for your product, but at the same time, you may not be able to access loans to grow your business because you are asked to use land registration or ownership as collateral for that loan. So there are these structural issues that are not tackled, and therefore the information may be good, but it really does not change anything. So we know that information needs to be linked to a transformative analysis and transformative practice. Another example is the extent to which women's economic activity is excluded from many sets of statistics because it is either considered to be in the informal, that is the unrecorded or monitored parts of the economy, or there is no formal economic value placed on it. And we have talked about the care and domestic work that women do in their families. Lack of relevant information also inhibits or weakens effective advocacy efforts by women's rights and other organizations. This is a global phenomenon. We know, for instance, that recently in the UK, the publication of gender-based disparities in BBC pay for many of its key on-air talent drastically increased the impact of advocacy for equal pay and forced the hand of the BBC to take the action to eliminate those disparities, we hope. So lack of information means that analysis is often inadequate and inappropriate. And if you start with a wrong information base, how do you then develop effective and relevant policies, practices, and structures? So for women in Africa, this can lead to unhelpful focus on specific areas of economic empowerment. For instance, investing in business skills for women entrepreneurs rather than eliminating discriminatory practices from financial institutions that limit women's access to credit and other resources and products. Now, we know that if women had better access to information, the benefits could be greater. They could influence the collection of information, collation and analysis, and therefore the production of more relevant information. They would be stronger and more strategic and better targeted advocacy capacity. And then there would be evidence-based investments in ways that leverage change, and the development and promotion of economic security and justice agendas that are more holistic in approach and highlights systemic inequity in long-term and sustainable interventions. There is an organization based in Accra, the African Women's Development Fund, that works a lot on economic justice issues. And they've just produced a Futures Africa book looking at Africa over the next, well, it's not the 50 years like the African Union, but they come up with a set of what they call feminist concerns at the end. And one of them is that if we look at the feminist concerns around equity, equality, and justice, what new questions might we need to ask in economic theory and data collection that might help promote a wider analysis of economic trends and a greater diversity of economic models? And how can these models better account for women's economic contributions and concerns? I think that this is useful, especially when we think of the training needs of younger scholars and how we train them not to reproduce the same ways of looking at economic and social phenomena. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Hanna Kristjansdottir. She is a former Icelandic minister, mayor, and parliamentarian. She currently is the chair of the executive board of the Women's Political Leaders Global Forum. And before that, she was Minister of Interior after getting elected to the Althing in 2013. And she was the mayor of Reykjavik. From 2008 to 2010, then the president for the city council from 2006 to 2008, and a member of the city council from 2002 to 2013. From 2008 to 2010, she served as the mayor of Reykjavik, and in 2013, she was elected to the Parliament of Iceland and the first MP for the Reykjavik South constituency. In the same year, she was elected as the vice chairman of the Independence Party. So with all that, it's no wonder that she's going to speak to us about women's political participation and voice.
Dear guests, thank you so much for this introduction. I can see and hear from it that I need to make sure that the years are less convincing. It sounds as if I'm way older than I am. No, thank you so much. And dear guests, thank you so much to all of you for inviting me. And of course, on behalf of WPL, Women Political Leaders Global Forum, we are thrilled to be here. Super excited, as at least my 19-year-old teenager would say, to be here at the Carter Center. I've of course followed this for a long time, the activities and the missions here, and I'm very honored to be here with you today. I'm really honored as well to be with these speakers here and all of you today. And thanks for the morning session, which was both informative and inspiring. As mentioned in the introduction, by our moderator, I am the chair of WPL. Hoping, of course, that all of you know everything about it, but knowing that I might have to fill into the gaps. WPL stands for Women Political Leaders. It is a global forum for every woman on an international level that has been elected by her national parliament to be a member of parliament or to be a member of government. So it's not sort of a group of all women that are involved or interested in politics. It's for the ones that are leading on a national level. And this is their place to get together, to come together, speak about their experience, sharing solutions, and sharing some hope of how things can be done and how we can increase the number for women in politics. And as our moderators say, it's of course understandable that a woman that has been, I was involved personally, just to add on this, I was involved in politics in Iceland for longer than I care to remember, 25 years. Started as a young woman and did all the things you do when you climb up the ladder in a political environment, like in my home country, but decided when I turned 50 that enough was enough and wanted to do something else than to take part on the stage that politics are, at least on a national scale, and maybe something I will say here today will reflect on that, why I left, and why it's great to be in politics, but why it's still super great to be out. But then I have been working with the women political leaders and how we do this, because we have all these women in our, it's not a formal organization, it's non-partisan, it's non-profit, it's a foundation with just one mission, that is to increase the number. We want to increase the number of women taking part in politics. We don't have any sort of political, although we might have in our heart, but we don't reflect on that in our job, how we want this done or what is the best way to do it. We just assist and provide for the platform. We also do this via research. We do a lot of research with universities and other identities, international identities, in order to try and find out why aren't there more women in politics and how could we make that happen and reach the dream of gender parity there. We also do it via campaigns. We do a lot of campaigns. We do campaigns for girls, for example, where we go into schools around the world trying to make sure that girls see this as their place, as well as the guys. And we also do a really interesting leadership campaign with male heads of states, where they come out and say, we would love for this to change, and we would like to advocate for that. So we do it on a different level. And dear guest, let me tell you, because it was addressed here earlier, that we don't only do all this work for the women that are already in power or for the ones that we hope will be in power in the nearby future. Coming again to a personal sort of history of mine. I'm from the country that has been ranked #1 in gender equality for 9 years in a row, Iceland. Iceland is said to be the dream country for every girl to grow up. And I mean, of course, being an Icelander like I am, I could say it is. But believe me, it's no paradise when it comes to gender equality. No country is. We still feel there is a huge difference in being a woman in politics in Iceland than being a man still. But when we are doing all this job in making sure that the women that are in politics feel their place and sense of belonging, and have a sort of platform on their own, it's also to make sure that the young women of the world, the young girls, have a platform. When I was growing up, and I'm 52 years old, when I was growing up, there was one woman in parliament in Iceland. I was what you today would call a political nerd for a young child. I loved politics. watched them like cartoons, and thought they were the best fun. But I never saw any woman there. They were all men. It was a male-dominated world. So although I was really seriously interested, I never saw it as something I could or would do. That's why I went into university. I studied politics. I studied international politics. But I was never determined to do it on my own, do it for myself. I just wanted to be in the back supporting somebody else. And that's sort of the average for women. But when my mother was growing up, there was no woman in parliament then. So she had none. I had one. And then growing up, the numbers got higher. And now I have two daughters that are 13 and 19. And now in the Parliament of Iceland, we have 42%, 58. So it's almost a gender parity. And you can imagine the more, how likely it is that they see this as their place. And I feel my experience from being in politics would be that this is the main hurdle. Women don't see this as their place. And the guys in the room and the guys in politics can say, come again. This is ridiculous. I mean, you can enter this as well as us. What is the problem? The problem is, and I said this earlier to Ambassador when we were speaking at a meeting here, I felt for the 25 years I was active in politics as the guest. I think that describes it the best. And I am around women political leaders around the world every day in my work, and we find this to explain how we feel and how I felt. It's not that we were unwelcomed. It's not that I was unwelcomed. No, 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 no. I was really welcomed, but I was a guest. I was not the host. And that is the difference. This culture of politics has been developing for thousands of years and has been done by men and the way they want to do things. So we're invited, and it's constantly being said, we want you women to take part. We want you to be there, but we're invited to be there. So as long as we have that feeling, and again, when we're talking about how can we change this, and again to the guys in the room and to men in general, they need to listen. That would be the greatest step, for men to listen how women feel and not just counteract that, but say, okay, just take that in. Women still feel, the majority of women, and all our research, and we've done several, show that women still feel as guests. And that is the main reason why they don't enter. So we have to have that in mind. And this is super important, and this is when we come to the fact of information and women. Women in politics, whether they are active or not, they need to know this. So when we say this out loud, several leading women have done so, many in this country here, have said out loud, it is super difficult to be a woman in politics. And some might say, isn't this discouraging? Should you be saying this? Yes. This needs to be said loud and clear. Because then the women that are active will know that they are not alone, and we will prepare the women that want to enter on how things are. I don't know what your mother did when you had your first child, those of you who've had a child. Mine sat in front of me when I was expecting my first child, and somebody had said to me, you should discuss with your mother how it will be. She will be the sort of the experience you can rely on, because it's very often similar experience for a mother and a daughter. So I talked to her, and my mother, being the kind, encouraging person she wanted to be, and has always been for me, said, well, Hanna, this really isn't a tough job. This isn't really that bad. I can tell you, yeah, I mean, resting on my experience, you have the child, and then you forget all about the pain and everything. And I'm like, okay, thank you so much. And I went into labor without any sort of technical assistance, without any of the drugs that were invited and stuff like that, because I thought it would be that easy. Not easy, but I rested on that experience. My mother came to me when I had my child the day after, and she was, of course, as all of us, super happy, but she said, what is wrong with you, Hanna? The look on your face is as if you were hit by a train. And I'm like, dear mother, why didn't you tell me how awful this is? I mean, why didn't you just level with me on the fact that this is the most difficult thing you can ever do in your life when it comes to sort of physical pain? Why didn't you just tell me? Then she said, well, I thought it would be not encouraging for you. And I think we have the same thing in politics. When I was involved in politics, I very often went in a podium like this and said, girls, this is really not a problem. This really is, I've never felt it really to be difficult to be a woman in politics. But this is not the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to tell it like it is. Give the information, tell the stories, be really candid about the whole thing. And then the women that will enter, they will know. And they can provide themselves, arm themselves with what is needed. So this is why it is so super important for people to tell the stories like they are. And if that will not be enough, because sometimes that is not enough, then we can rest on the facts. If people think that there is no need for a specific action or anything to do when it comes to participation of women in politics, then I'll just rest my case and say, are we happy with the fact that in 2018, 23% of members of parliaments around the world are women, 77% are men. In the same year, 2018, only 18% of the world government ministers are women, 82% are men. And when we look at heads of states, only 7% of the world's heads of state are women, 93% are men. And for me, this literally closes the discussion. Literally, it closes the discussion. This has to change, this needs to change, not only for women, because politics needs women way more than women needs politics. Politics are fun, but we can stay out of them. But politics and society desperately needs women. Research and everything show that the society will gain from it in so many ways. I'm not going to dwell on that because you have access to all the information on that. But believe me, it is really, it will change the world and make it a way, way better place. But moving a little bit to because I want to leave you with an on a positive note. Some might say, because we have not been moving too fast. According to the statistics today, if we just sit here and wait, gender equality will be here in 100 years. We will have gender equality in 100 years, but we will not then have economic parity. We will not have the gender equality there. We will have to wait 172 years for that. And if people are happy with that, I will not be. I will struggle every second of my life. But I was hoping really that it would be something for my daughters. I'm leaving the thought that it will be for me. But if it's for our grand, whatever, this is way too late and things need to be done. So how can we do it? If we just leave the analyzing the problem, what is to be done? Then I want to leave you with some thoughts. I, again, come from the great country of Iceland, where you find this weather not too nice. We have snowstorm and minus whatever in Iceland. So for me, this is summertime. But if we rest on the Icelandic case, what we have found, because we're number one, and somebody might be able to learn something from that. Of course, we're few, so it's easier. But putting that aside, what has been the key of success for this? I would like to mention, I think, 3 or 4 things. First, it's role models. You need to have them there in order for the others to be there. I'm not a super fan of quotas, but still, I know that these things matter. Numbers matter. And women, when they are role models, should, in my opinion, allow themselves to be women. Be the incubator of change, do things differently. Not just go in the shoes of those who went before them, but do the change. So, role models, number 1. And now this is another thing which I know is hard to achieve, but political consensus is necessary. Political consensus across party lines is vital. All of the big steps that Iceland has taken when it comes to law or regulating or doing taking progressive decisions has been made across party lines, always. So this is why information, again, are so important. people need to face the facts and work across party lines on this. At least for us, that has been the case that has changed everything. It isn't debated in Icelandic politics whether or not this is important. It's actually something we are super proud of, and as much men as women, as much those from the right and left. The third thing I have to mention is the fact that women take way more care of household and children than men do. That's just a fact. If you don't provide for affordable and good daycare, this is literally impossible. In Iceland, everybody can access fairly cheap, or at least affordable, good daycare for their kids. Everybody can do it. And nobody thinks that it's like not taking care of your kid. It's just it's school. We say it's preschool. And the most revolutionary thing I would like to mention in that respect, but that is the single one issue that has changed Icelandic society and the world of women of my generation, is the shared maternity law. I have 2 kids, as I told you earlier. Of course, they were in my belly the whole time, believe me. Their father sometimes tried to convince them that it was otherwise, that we shift turns, because he was as much with them as I did. The thing is that in Iceland, it works like this. When you have a child, the parents are granted 9 months. We can debate on whether that's too long or too short. They have 9 months. The mother gets 3, and she cannot transfer that to her husband or to the father of the child. The father gets 3, and he can as well not give that or transfer that to the mother. And then they have 3 months where they can divide the time amongst themselves. For me, this was 5 months for my husband, because then I was then in a really, really aggressive work period. So I took 4 months. And believe me when I tell you, this is the revolutionary change. Because when women can take decisions about their future without worrying, it's the greatest worry. It's the most beautiful thing to have a child. But when you are supposed to do that without any assistant or without the co-parenting of the other parent, it becomes a real struggle. So this is not only the greatest change, because when I'm sitting in front of, for example, Coca-Cola, let's say I'm applying for a job, it doesn't matter whether it's me or my husband, we are both as likely to leave for the kid. Not just when we have the child, but in my experience, the greatest change is there when my kids, for example, were ill or sick and woke up in the middle of the night. They were just as likely to shout for their father as to shout for me, because the burden was shared. And believe me, this is not just great for me to be able to work on my career. My husband would tell you, this is the greatest thing that ever happened to me. No Icelandic man would sit in front of his friend or peers and say, I'm not going to do this. Everybody would say, are you serious? This is the greatest thing happening to you in life, and you're just not going to be there. Nobody does it. They all take the leave. So that is the dramatic change that has made sure that the wage gap has lowered, made sure that the opportunities are the same, and made sure that men also can be part and can feel how great gender equality is and how that can change the world, because it does change the world. Men are no different from us. They don't only need work and career, they also need family and taking care of the ones they love. So it's like it has changed everything, and it has made sure that women and men in Iceland feel that they live in a gender equal society, and it has made sure that at least me as a politician and as a chair for the WPL has witnessed it on my own skin again and again and again, how great information on gender equality, how information on women and our lives can literally change the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna. Thanks so much. Now I'd like to introduce Delia Ferreira-Rubio. She is the chair of Transparency International, elected as of October 2017, and the former president of Transparency International's chapter in Argentina, She also has served as chief advisor for several representatives and senators at the Argentine National Congress and has advised the Constitutional Committee for both the House of Representatives and Senate and National Accounting Office. Currently, she works as an independent consultant and has consulted on anti-corruption and related issues with international organizations and NGOs, mainly in Latin America. Delia has also a PhD in law from Madrid's Complutense University and is the author of numerous publications on democratic culture and political institutions, comparative politics, and public and parliamentary ethics. She was elected to Transparency International's board in 2008 and 2011, and then, as I mentioned earlier, then again as chair in 2017. So with that, I'm going to welcome her to the podium, and she's, of course, going to talk about her expertise on corruption and accountability and the impact that has on women.
Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Carter Center and Laura, especially when you for many, many years. And thank you, all of you, for coming. It's a wonderful opportunity. And as Hanna was mentioning, the place of women in politics, I wrote, I don't feel a guest in the fight against corruption as a woman, because woman has been here for the very, very long time and from the very beginning. So Laura asked me to talk particularly about access to information and the fight against corruption. And I would start by saying that access to information has nothing to do with curiosity. We are not here asking questions or trying to hold governments accountable because we are curious. Access to information has to do with the fundamental principles of democracy and good government. Full stop. This is not just curiosity about some data. And when lack of information appears, and it is a reality in many of our countries, it affects individual rights because citizens are exposed to abuse of powers and the loss of their rights and the impossibility to really exercise the rights, and also affect globally the whole society, because capture of state is based on lack of access to information. That's the opening door for arbitrary decision, discretionary decision, and it leads to abuse of power. And in this sense, lack of access to information generates corruption. That's why for us, fighting corruption in the world, access to information is the very essential and crucial tool we start working with, because it prevents corruption. Clearly, it facilitates the disclosure and discovery of conflicts of interest. And conflicts of interest are the opening window for corruption and the abuse of public power. It maximizes the risks and costs that those involved in corruption may face, and in this way, access to information is a deterrent from corruption. And it also helps us to monitor and assess public policies. Without information, it is impossible to determine whether public policies has been decided because of public good or because we are giving back favors received as campaign resources or campaign finance or other kind of compromises assumed during election time, for instance. So the relation between access to information and the fight against corruption is really essential. But access to information is more than just a right in itself. It's a foundational right. How can I monitor the authorities that I have elected without information? How can I demand my rights without knowing what those rights are? How can I really act? How can I really put in force what the laws contemplates as my rights as citizens? And when we talk about information, we are not just talking about very important, complicated data and statistics and so complex public policies. We are also talking about information as the very essential things, as the chickens that Madame Turi mentioned. Just that, the rights, the ways that I can use to guarantee those rights, the way in which I can proceed, the where, when, what, and why. The simple questions. That's the information we are fighting for. In this sense, access to information is a precondition for other rights. It is essential. And it is also essential to generate input to the more very crucial right in democracy, which is participation. And Sanjay was mentioning that. Open government is not just data sharing. It is participation, more important. And many countries, at least in Latin America, don't get that second part. It's just putting information out in the web portals and we are done. And then in Davos recently, I heard a Latin American president that was asked, have you improved in your anti-corruption perception or in your transparency perception? And he says, yes, wonderfully, 20 points up, because we have put lots of information in the web portals. And that was his idea of transparency and open government. So we are talking here about essential rights and participation. And that's the key issue when we talk about accountability. And when we talked about participating with informed decisions, it's not just putting a like in a Twitter or raising a hand or calling the politician in turn. No, it is participating in the policy design, but on an informed basis. And access to information is not only granted because we have the laws in the books. We already have them. We have fought for years in order to have the laws in the constitutions, in the legislation, but that's not enough. It's necessary, but that's not enough. Just last week, in order to tell you a real example in Argentina. Last year, we approved the law of access to information. After many years, we were one of the latest countries in the region to approve the law. And it took 1 year to the government to implement the law. And we waited for the implementation. And one of my colleagues asked a very simple question through a petition of access to information, and he portrayed the whole procedure through the electronic measure, which is very modern. And after 70 days, it was a very simple question, 70 days, he received an answer from the last of the public officials who received the petition, which says, you should go to Google and Google that, because in Google you can find the answer. It's written and it's signed. So, and we have the law in the Constitution, we have the right. We need to implement that in a serious way, because it's not curiosity or just bothering the time of our public officials. And now coming to gender and corruption and access to information. Some theories at the very, let's say 20 years ago, said that women are honest than men. That's an essentialist approach, which nowadays very, very few people share. Of course, there are cultural situations, there are legal situations, but the importance of parity or equal representation has nothing to do with the fact that we are more honest than men. It has to do with the fact that we are more than half of the population, and you cannot call any system a democracy when you left aside half of the population. So we need more women. I agree with the fight Anna is given. But of course, we need that on the basis that we deserve equal representation, and we are half of the population. And of course, the whole society will benefit from this half of the population being part of the, I would say being invited, but I would say now being part of this place, this common place. So once this thesis was presented, the idea from the political or the public policy point of view was every problem regarding corruption will be solved with more women. So you put more women in police force, no problem with corruption in police force. You incorporate more women in the military, no problem with corruption there, and so on and so forth. And some countries took the idea and went ahead, but the results were really what they were expecting for. This idea came from a very simple correlation that was made some time ago between the perception index of corruption created by Transparency International and the number of women in parliament, particularly in the lower houses. And they found that it was very easy to establish a correlation at the top of the more transparent countries in the world, the Scandinavian countries, and the number of women that took part in politics in those countries. And that was easy. So more women, more transparency, problem solved. The problem is that that's not true in many regions. If you disaggregate both numbers, the reality is completely different. For instance, in Latin America or in the Americas in general, there are countries that are very well positioned in terms of transparency, like Chile or Uruguay, and they have no quota, no participation really of a significant number of women in parliament, although Chile has had a president. There are other countries with almost parity, like Argentina, with a president like Cristina Kirchner, and we are fed up with corruption, absolutely. So these correlations that seem to be too simple to present should be analyzed in a more detailed and in-depth in order to find out whether there are other variables in the situation that explains why in a country with a lot of women in parliament you have corruption, and in a country with no women in parliament, you have transparency. So it's not one-to-one, and of course, it's not a relation of cause and effect, which will be really a wrong approach in order to public policies design. But there are aspects where really gender has a role in relation to corruption. And in this way, I would like to separate what is grand corruption, the great scandals, the Odebrecht scandal, for instance, nowadays, and what is petty corruption, the small corruption that is faced by many, many people in the world when they try to access a right, access a service, access subsidy, access social security. And in this very low-level corruption, there is a great asymmetry between the two parts. When we talk about grand corruption, we have high-level officials and very, very important multinational business persons. They are powerful, both of them. When you come to petty corruption, the asymmetry is really enormous. You have a public official with lots of power because he has the power to put thumbs up or thumbs down, and a simple person asking for help, asking for the rights that probably he doesn't know he has, but he is asking for his or her rights or the rights of the family in a necessity position. And it has to do also with gender because of the feminization of poverty, and that's a fact. And it has also to do with the fact that in many countries, women are not in charge of the management of the family resources, so they have no power to decide whether to pay that bribe they are asking. And it has to do, of course, with the care function in society, because women are more exposed to the bribery asked from official, because she is in charge of care and she has to go to the hospital, the school, or whatever it is. So she is more exposed. And one very important thing in this realm is the different currency used in order to pay these bribes. Because when women are asking for the right and are asking for the social security service, for the delivery of whatever it is, or for the place in the school or a bed in a hospital, many times the currency they are asked to pay has to be with sextortion. And that represents really a difference in terms of the currency exchange in corruption cases when women are the victims of corruption. So when designing public policies, we have to take care of this also. We have to take in mind that it is not the same, it's not the same situation when men are asked the bribe in this kind of petty corruption situation and when women are asked to pay a bribe. In this respect, it is important to take into account that the global barometer of corruption, which is another tool that Transparency International presents every 2 years, clearly points out that the sectors in which there are more corruption are the following: health, education, social security, police, and courts. And the barometer is a survey on the population. It's not leaders, it's the population in each country. If you look at the three first, health, education, social security, it has to do with the care function in society. And there, women are more exposed to corruption with the consequence of the currency that sometimes they are asked. And policy and courts are another very important area in terms of gender and corruption for policy development, because where do we resort in cases of domestic violence, in cases of discrimination, in cases of harassment? We went to police and court. And when corruption is very embedded in those institutions, we have an extra burden on women. So gender and corruption is an issue that we should take care of in this realm. And just one word to finish this. I think that we have been talking about many of these issues for many years, but we should start talking about another one, which has to do with access to information and to the rights of women, which is the problem of algorithm and artificial intelligence. We are not discussing that. We should start asking what the algorithms say. Who developed and who deployed the algorithm? The studies in international information and technology says that the ones designing algorithms, which then decide on a very neutral way our rights, our access to credit, and so many other things nowadays, are designed mainly by young white men. So, if the problem is that with algorithms we are trying to better the decision process, so faulty when humans are in charge of deciding, we should start asking about algorithms, because that's the algocracy which is coming, and algorithms are created by humans who have the same biases that they have when they decide on a public policy on a service delivery. Thank you very much.
So to wrap up our panel, I'd love to introduce you to Dubravka Simonovic. Dubravka has been an appointee of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and its causes and consequences in July of 2015 by the UN Human Rights Council for an initial 3-year tenure. She started her tenure on August 1st, 2015. She was a member of the CEDAW committee between 2002 and 14 and served as its chairperson in 2007 and 2008. Its follow-up rapporteur for 2009 to 2011, and as the chairperson for the Optimal Protocol Working Group in 2011. For a number of years, she headed the Human Rights Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the United Nations in New York. Excuse me, I'm sorry. The Republic of Croatia, and she was posted as the Minister Plenipotentiary at the Permanent Mission of Croatia to the United Nations in New York. She was also the ambassador to the OSCE and the United Nations in Vienna. She was the chairperson of the UN Commission on the Status of Women between 2001 and 2002, and also worked as a member of the UNIFEM Consultative Committee. At the regional level, she was the chair and vice chair of the Council of Europe's Task Force to Combat Violence Against Women, including domestic violence in 2006 and 2007. Between 2008 and 2010, she co-chaired the ad hoc committee that elaborated the Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. She holds a PhD in family law from the University of Zagreb, and she is the author of several books and articles on women's rights and violence against women. She's also lectured at Harvard Law School, Nottingham University, at Urban Morgan Institute for the Human Rights, and the Women's Human Rights Training Institute organized by the Bulgarian Gender Research Foundation. She is a visiting professor in practice at the Center for Research on Peace and Security at LSE. So welcome to Dubravka.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this long introduction. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank the Carter Center and Ambassador Peterson and Laura for inviting me to be here and to be inspired by you. And I hope that each of you will be also inspired by some initiatives of my mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences. Here, this panel, you are hearing different stories related to right to information and access to information by women. And I will give you perspective of my mandate that is dealing with all forms of violence against women, its causes and consequences. If we look at where we are now in terms of violence against women, I think that we will all agree that violence against women is widespread, pervasive, women's human rights violation, and a form of discrimination against women. It's happening in all countries, all over the world, with high level of impunity and with high level of acceptance high level of tolerance of different forms of violence against women. My experience when I was in CEDAW committee for 12 years, and I would like to acknowledge the presence of Bandana Rana from CEDAW committee also. My experience from CEDAW committee was that different forms of violence are present in all countries all over the world. And now when I have possibility to travel to countries, and from the beginning of my mandate, I have visited South Africa, Georgia, Israel, Palestine, Argentina, Australia, and Bahamas. And I'm usually visiting shelters, I'm visiting different places, talking to governments, government officials, non-governmental representatives, and so on. And what I have seen everywhere is this acceptance of violence against women as something normal. And we have to really challenge this and turn it around. And we have to look what are our tools, how we should do it. There are different possibilities. And this morning, inspiring statements were already presenting different frameworks and possibilities in front of us. It was mentioned by a few speakers that we are dealing with dominant patriarchal ideology of men's entitlement and privilege over women's embedded in different legal systems that are, be it discriminatory laws or discriminatory practices, and discriminatory laws were mentioned. If we look, for example, at work of the CEDAW committee, and I was for 12 years there now, committee members are continuing with this, you will see for 189 state parties to CEDAW convention, clearly recognition of discriminatory laws, even discriminatory pieces of constitution that are still there. In a Beijing, when we had Beijing conference at that time, we decided that we will focus on elimination of discriminatory laws. Now they are still there. So what are we doing? What we are doing wrong? Why we are not able to push such changes that would give women those rights that they deserve under all those important UN human rights instruments. And there are also other trends now, because we do have on one side positive trends with respect to gender equality and recognition of women's rights as human rights. We are seeing this. We are seeing a lot of talk about gender, but we also have negative trends. So in addition to this patriarchy, we are now having another ideology, so-called gender ideology, that is present in different countries, that is denying gender equality as a rule, and that is even denying term gender. So they are basically saying that biological differences between women and men result in specific gender roles, and such roles should be preserved. And I have seen emergence of such ideology in different European states and also in some Latin American states. On the other hand, we are seeing also some positive trends, like Me Too campaign, that is really showing that when women are speaking, when they are revealing their stories, what was mentioned as we should tell what is happening, we should come out with all those stories and share those experiences. And then we are seeing that public opinion is now changing for the first time. For the first time, this idea of zero tolerance to violence against women is coming out as reality. We are seeing that those men are not anymore enjoying impunity, that they are stepping down, and that this is a very important sign that we are going in the right direction. Also this morning, Under-Secretary General and other speakers mentioned the importance of 2030 agenda adopted at the United Nations. And this is very important to recognize that the first time among 17 Sustainable Development Goals applicable to all society, among those goals, goal number 5 is addressing achieving gender equality and empowerment of women, and for the first time, goal number 2 is elimination of violence against women and girls in all areas, in private and public sphere. Elimination of harmful practices is goal number 3. So for the first time, we do have this comprehensive agenda, but now we have to see at the UN how to use instruments that we have, like CEDAW Convention and other human rights instruments, in order to achieve those results that are really supporting the idea that women's rights are human rights. And it was also said this morning that this is very powerful. powerful recognition of women's rights as human rights. And my personal experience is that CEDAW Convention imposed that idea of women's rights as human rights in whole UN framework on human rights. And now other treaty bodies under different conventions are also trying to introduce gender perspective with respect to different rights, including right to information, right to freedom of expression, and all other rights that are present in those conventions. So it's not only CEDAW, it's also other conventions. It's not only my mandate of a special rapporteur on violence against women, it's also other mandate holders, freedom of expression, right to privacy, torture, many of them that should also include gender perspective and focus on different sets of rights that they are dealing with. I would also like to mention that when I started as a special rapporteur on violence against women, I was thinking, what should I do based on my experience that was briefly explained here. And I had opportunity to start from without knowing anything about gender equality in my country, Croatia, in 1994, before the Beijing conference. Then I attended the Beijing conference. I was at that time working for the government. And for the first time, I really started to use those instruments that are out. Because many times now in this mandate position, I am seeing that women do not know their rights. They are not using instruments. They are not using this mandate. And we need to change this. So as a special rapporteur, I have inherited from my predecessor idea that at the global level we need a new convention on violence against women. My response to that was to invite all other global and regional mechanisms to provide me their views, and also academicians and non-governmental organizations. I have received more than 295 submissions with different viewpoints, some of them arguing for convention, some of them arguing that we do not need new convention because we do have CEDAW convention that is already covering violence against women, and that we need to use what we have, that there is no time now to elaborate new instruments while we have a current one. Some of them calling for something else, something new, some observatories that would focus on implementation of this agenda on violence against women. So based on that, I have presented a report to United Nations Third Committee, and I have suggested that in terms of what we have as a framework, we should use this framework better, because now there is huge implementation gap between those norms in CEDAW Convention, in Declaration on Elimination of Violence Against Women, in regional treaties, and their implementation. Countries are ratifying, but they are not really incorporating. Laws are not in line with those instruments, and implementation is lacking. So we have to focus on implementation. And for that reason, now it was already mentioned that at the CSW, forthcoming CSW, states are going to decide what is going to be 2020 review. Since I was in Beijing, and I was once upon a time chairperson of the CSW, I'm seeing growing importance of this body, intergovernmental body that is dealing with women's rights. And I think that now CSW should be really brave to go into the direction of calling for the fifth World Women's Conference, because we should not be afraid. And I have presented this in my last statement to the CSW last year, and I intend to repeat this. We should say that we need implementation conference. We should not reopen Beijing, but we should change our approach, how we are discussing all those topics. Because at each session of the CSW, we are going around 12 topics that are there. But I think that in the future, at each session of the CSW, we need to look at political participation of women, violence against women, online violence against women, all those topics that are coming out, what is happening in different regions, in different parts of the world, to listen stories related to political participation of women, good examples how in Iceland women changed this position of women in parliament in a lifetime cycle. So it is important to share that type of stories in order to change in a faster manner. And it was already said that we would need 100 years to proceed with this pace of progress. But we should also go backwards, because there are negative trends. And we do have all those new technologies, internet, ICT facilitated channels that are not only able to transmit women's rights as human rights, but also patriarchal norms and everything else that is in violating women's rights. So we have to see that we have to be very structured, and we have to use instruments and mandates that are already there, that are not sufficiently used. So for that reason, I have started a few initiatives. I have started at UN level initiative related to institutional cooperation between independent mechanisms like mine, because I'm an independent mechanism. I'm not part of the UN system. I do not receive UN salary. I am appointed by Human Rights Council, and I do have possibility to be more critical than persons working for the UN. I am really trying to be constructive in that type of criticism. And what I have seen and what I have learned is that during my 12 years in CEDAW, during that time, I never had information about other regional systems dealing with women's rights and violence against women. And I was thinking, how come? How is this possible? Because now as a special rapporteur, I'm traveling to Latin Organization of American States, I'm traveling to African Commission on Human Rights, I'm traveling to Council of Europe to talk to Gravio, dealing with Council of Europe Convention that I was at one time really very much connected with as a co-chair of that committee that developed that convention. So based on that, I have suggested that we need institutional cooperation between mechanisms like mine and other similar mechanisms at global and regional level. And we already had a meeting with UN Secretary General last year, and he immediately supported that initiative. But nothing is happening. You see, at the UN level, to change things and to move around, it's not easy. So now I'm doing it as a project with support of some states that are giving additional money. And this is a project by which we are going to meet at the next session of the CSW, all those mechanisms, CEDAW, Gravio Committee, Commissioner from Africa, Commissioner from Latin America, Belém do Pará, chairperson. They're all going to be there, and we will be there at a panel chaired by Deputy Secretary General. But in the future, it should be regular part of the CSW session. Now we are side event. So I think that we have to see how to use those mechanisms that are there. Just to briefly mention another initiative, I have launched initiative on a Femicide Watch, or Gender-Related Killings of Women Watch. And this is something that, that is showing up objectively what is the level of this extreme form of violence in different countries all over the world. And this is something what Laura pointed out when she mentioned how she started, or Madam Ambassador pointed out when Laura wanted to have evidence what is wrong with respect to right to information and women, because there are structural problems that are basically causing those structural problems in different areas of human rights for women. And in this area of gender-related killings of women, it is clear that all states have data on homicides. They have, but when you ask about gender-related killings of women, now only specific Latin American states do have data on femicides, but only on prosecuted cases, not on all gender-related killings. So there are differences. And I think that in the future, all countries should collect data on gender-related killings in terms of women killed by their intimate partners or family relatives as a one category, and the other category could be country-specific because there are differences all over the world. And then we will be able to develop femicide rate indicator to see what is the level of that type of violence. And another proposal is that we have experts, national experts in each country, multidisciplinary bodies that will go through cases, because they are not only numbers, they are stories, life stories, names. They are women with their children. There are things that should be addressed at the national level in terms of gaps of prevention and protection system that is not as it should be. And I think that each case is showing what is not going well. And if we have a number of cases showing that protection orders, for example, are not efficient, that shelters are not available, that police officers are not sensitized, that judiciary is not properly addressing violence against women, then that should be direction at the national level. And I think that in the future we will go in that direction. I have also produced a report on shelters and protection orders in order to send this message that shelters should be available in all countries and protection orders, but this is not the case. In majority of states, there are no shelters, and states are thinking that shelters are voluntary commitments that they are sometimes supporting, sometimes not supporting. They are not seeing shelters as regular part of their protection that they should afford to victims of violence. And now let me mention my two forthcoming reports that are most relevant for this session. My next report is on ICT-facilitated violence against women, or online violence against women. I'm still contemplating what should be the name. Is it going to be online violence or ICT-facilitated violence? Because ICT is more inclusive word, and online is showing maybe specific problems related to internet. And we have seen that internet is opening now extreme possibilities in terms of information sharing. It's going out without borders. It is extremely important for freedom of expression, for access to information, and so on. But in the same time, this internet and ICTs are not properly connected with human rights norms that we have developed up to now. And those human rights, we are saying human rights protected offline should be protected online. This is nice, and I agree with this. But how to do it if those human rights protected offline are not really incorporated, are not really implemented, are not yet there at the state level? And now we have to, in the same time, think how to preserve freedom of expression as extremely important freedom, and in the same time, not allow violence against women and different forms of violence that are now possible through internet. I think that we have to go in small steps, and that my report is only going to open this field because there are too many issues that should be considered, and we have to sit around and really join forces of different special rapporteurs, different treaty bodies, different UN agencies to see how to go properly in direction of securing freedom of information, but also which type of information, and also eliminating different forms of violence against women. And also, access to internet is different in different countries. UN already produced a report in which is visible that the gender digital divide is showing clearly. In developing countries it is 30%, in developing countries 16%, in developed 2.8%. So this access to ICTs and internet is very important, and content is also extremely important if we are serious about women's rights as human rights. So I hope that this conference and this focus on information will go in direction of really focusing on access to information as a human rights, as a right itself, and right that is enabling other rights to be really enjoyed by women. Thank you.
So I now realize that we're standing between you and lunch. Laura, I think we're going to go ahead and just close out this session, and I give one big more round of applause to these wonderful women for the work they do.
Thank you for that amazing morning, and so much to think about. We not only now have food for thought, but soon we will also have food. So I'd like to invite you to lunch. It will be out this door and to the right. We gave a bit of a longer lunch, so I'd like to kind of truncate it back to about an hour and try and meet back here and get ourselves back on time.